Hi there, and welcome to this week's Career Insights from 1080. So I am joined this week by Maria and Michael, who are going to be talking about securing a role in the not-for-profit sector. So welcome back to both of you. You've both been on a few times before.
Thank you.
So as always, please do like, comment and ask questions throughout, and let us know where you are joining us from. So just to start with, I'm going to ask Maria and Michael both to share a little bit about their experience of working in the not-for-profit industry, or sector, sorry. So Maria, do you want to start?
Sure. So for many years, I worked in financial services, so mainly in fund and investment management. But I got to the point where I wanted different experience. And I ended up working in the creative sector and in a not-for-profit. So very different. And I think when I kind of applied for the job, I didn't quite understand what not-for-profit was and what it meant. So it was interesting to observe the differences, really. And I would say in some respects, it wasn't that different. It was still very professional. The people I worked with were very, very capable, a really strong bunch. But there are some differences, and we were a members organisation, so we had artists were our members, and at the end of the day we were collecting fees for them, and our costs obviously needed to be kept kind of reasonable. So in that kind of context, you are working to try and be really efficient and to control costs, and obviously that affects factors that I know we'll talk about further down the line. But yeah, so not for profit for me.
Excellent, thank you. And Michael, I think yours was the other way around, wasn't it? So from not for profit.
Well, we're not. I don't necessarily have a background in not-for-profit, and after this, I think Maria is going to talk a little bit about how we're defining it. But I did start in the public sector and make the career transition into the private sector. And what we are going to talk today about is how you do make those transitions. Having said that, as a career coach, I've worked with a number of people who've gone in both directions. So I've worked with people based, for example, in charities or with bodies such as the British Council, and who've made transitions into the commercial environment. And I've also now worked with a number of people who, particularly when they start looking for mission and purpose, have decided, no, I want to move away from the commercial environment. I want to make a difference, and have moved in to the not-for-profit. Maria, do you want to sort of start by defining what not-for-profit covers, if you like?
Yeah, that's our first question. So yes, what is not-for-profit and what does that cover? So yeah, over to you, Maria.
Yeah. So the organisation I worked in was a members organisation. So it will be representing a professional group for a purpose. So for us, we were a significant source of income for our members. So we had thousands of artists, from the very well known to the not known at all. And we were representing them. We had legal people. We also had arts management experts who were responsible for keeping the artists happy, but also for liaising with people who were purchasing, auctioneers, galleries. Increasingly, work was being used for advertising, for fashion shoots, all sorts of things. So it was quite a fast developing environment as well, I would say, in that the context was changing a lot of the time in terms of how art is used and how people get paid. So yeah, a very interesting environment to be in.
Yeah, so we talked yesterday a bit about kind of other not-for-profit, so professional member services is kind of what you've been talking about, Maria.
Yeah.
Excellent. And then also charity is sometimes kind of lumped in with this not-for-profit, and also social enterprises, so things like Big Issue, Eden Project, those kinds of things. So it's kind of a bit of a mixture, and we talked a bit about the third sector, didn't we? So this is kind of like an overall coverall for that. Michael, anything to add?
Well, I was going to say, and because it's such a wide space, it's very hard to come up with general advice. So you've got charities like Save the Children, Oxfam, Barnardo's, through to very small charities, and so like employing probably no more than 5 or 6 people, but a host of volunteers. We're certainly seeing growth of social enterprise businesses. And I use the word business because their only real difference is they are generating profits, as we would term them. But those profits in turn get completely reinvested in the business. So they do have a very much commercial outlook. I also think we haven't got them on the list here, Sarah, but things like what I call NGOs. I reference people like the British Council, who are clearly absolutely have got some level of government funding, but themselves have got sort of funding through their commercial activities. And what they're trying to do in the British Council case is education, particularly education in the English language. So I must get rid of that. And so you have got sort of a very diverse audience here that you're going for. Very, very diverse indeed.
Okay. We've just had a few messages through. So Jeff's come in from America. So hi, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff.
Toyin, say hi, Toyin. He's one of my clients. And Kirill. So hi, Kirill.
Hi, Kirill.
And Jeff has asked a question. So interesting. So what are the differences in not-for-profit in the UK versus the US? Michael, have you got any ideas on that?
Well, I suspect Jeff may know better than me. The one I'm going to pull out, Jeff, is so, for example, if you take education universities, a good example, they are significantly better funded through alumni. So I think one of the key differences would be checking where the funding for the charity comes from and how they generate their revenues. Because if I'm going to say, if we look in the spectrum of being very commercial to not commercial, the desire to generate revenue is going to be a fair one. And my sense around in the States, a lot of foundations in particular are very well funded, whereas in the UK, funding tends to be a major issue. I don't know this, Jeff. One other thing in the UK, a lot of the charities have now stepped into areas of work that traditionally government used to provide. So if I take things like Ad Action, a drugs charity, they're providing care for drug offenders, and they are tendering to councils. So they're very sophisticated in how they get their tenders, and then have very long-term contract agreements. Now, I don't know what happens in the States around that, but that's a very different type of animal, dare I say it, to a smaller charity where they're much more reliant on what we call flag days or whatever. Does that help, Sarah?
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's really good. Maybe something for your podcast, Michael, that you talk about with Julian.
Yes, that's a good one. Yeah.
Excellent.
Good plug, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, in terms of working in a not-for-profit, so Maria, from your experience, and Michael, from your client's experience, what is it like working in the not-for-profit sector? So, do you want to start with that, Maria?
Yeah. I mean, I found it very, at times it's very challenging. There was a lot of kind of pressure on everybody, but at the same time, we really did try to look after the staff. So people work hard. There isn't a lot of room for kind of slack, really, because you are very conscious that any funding that we're using is taking away ultimately from our artists who are trying to help make a living. So, so it's quite tight. It's very professional. And for me, I mean, certainly the working environment was very good. We had beautiful offices, and I think that was felt to be very important. We had reasonable working kind of hours. Good provision for holiday. So there were lots of things that we tried to give people where we could, obviously, while still having a very kind of sharp eye on budgets and costs. But it was probably less different to a commercial environment than you might assume or expect, actually, because it is still commercial to a large extent. We're trying to get the best deal that we can for our artists.
Interesting. Okay. Great. And Michael, your experience?
And I'm going to put my head a little bit above the parapet and be controversial. I did say at the outset, it's very hard to generalise about the sector, given it's so varied and diverse. But I think Maria hits on a point. There may be a perception out there that people who work in the not-for-profit sector are less commercial. It's an easier life because you haven't got those pressures. And I'm in Maria's camp. I don't think that's the case. So I think any time I've worked with anybody in the wide not-for-profit space, budget is really an issue. I mean, in fact, I'm going to make the allegation, so to speak, that the more tight you are on budget, the more efficient the organisation has to be, because it has to be lean. And I'm also going to say, I think, because very often the people running these organisations are very passionate and committed to the cause, whether it's drug addicts or children or animals. They do expect their employees to have that same level of commitment, and therefore they can be quite harsh employers, dare I say. Some of these they don't want to spend lots of money on the staff, so you don't get sophisticated packages. And that's, for example, bonuses that doesn't operate. Often the working conditions, they've got second-hand furniture or they're in basements. They really are trying to keep costs very, very low. I know there's some good examples of very large charities where that's not the case, but I think that's difficult. And I do think they expect their staff to go above and beyond. Now, I am going to say it has some advantages. So a lot of people who come into the sector early on in their career, and they do so because they want to make a difference, you do get a very well-rounded sort of business background because there isn't much sort of fat on the bone. So you expect to do lots of things and you can develop very, very rapidly. And when I've worked with these people who go into commercial organisations later on, they are very well-rounded, had lots of responsibility at an early age. So it can very much work in your favour. But coming back to my original point, if you think this is an easy option, then I'm afraid you'll be disillusioned. Because I don't think it is an easy option.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
I would definitely agree with that. And what I would add in there is that I think it's also an environment where it's good if you're the sort of person who's prepared to pull your sleeves up when you need to.
Yeah.
So it's like
Absolutely.
you do all sometimes just pile in to get something done.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I love that. It's fun, but it's kind of, it is very much, you don't have clear set boundaries necessarily. You do all help each other as much as you can.
Brilliant. Okay, Jeff's come back with another comment saying, great answer on the differences, Michael. So there you go, well done. And we also have many small non-profits that struggle with funding. Okay. And then he's saying, I helped run a non-profit that had 0 employees and was totally volunteer. It's now been in business for almost 40 years. So excellent. So as you said, to expect that there'll be a cause there that's...
And before we go on, Jeff raised a really good point that a lot of these not-for-profit, it's not just about employees, but you have got volunteers. And dare I say it, from a management leadership, and when I talk to people, that's a very significant challenge because the people aren't there because they're getting paid. They're there because they want to, but they tend to want to do it their way. So in all these, and I've done some work, for example, with Citizens Advice, they're not easy business to run because they have such big volunteer workforces, and managing that in itself is a big challenge.
I'd also add in there that I think on the not-for-profit side, they have a board, and certainly we had quite a large board of non-directors who came for some very good organisations, but really wanted to get experience in the not-for-profit area. And that's, I think, an opportunity to do that and to really see what goes on. So, there are these kind of non-full-time, obviously much less than full-time positions where if you're interested in that sort of sector, you could look.
Okay.
Give it a flavour, so just before we move on, so people get a sense of the sector. I did some work. I'm not going to name the charity because that's not fair. But they were in the business of recycling clothing, selling that clothing, and the profit for that clothing went to Africa, for development purposes. And what I found was really frustrating and interesting is that the actual operation itself was incredibly inefficient, i.e. they weren't very good at the collection of the clothing. And getting them to think around how they could be more efficient, which in turn would generate more profit for their work, was very difficult. They would focus on how much profit they made and how they distributed it. That would have 90% of the board's time and probably 10% on the operational inefficiency. So again, if you're working within those businesses, you have to understand they have a different sort of raison d'etre, and you have to be, in my view, committed to what that raison d'etre is to get the best out of it. It's not like just a job. You need to understand they're trying to make a difference, but because they're trying to make a difference, it can be quite frustrating about how they run that business.
Yeah. Okay, so just before we move to the next question, you can see Jeff's had another comment which we've kind of touched on, I think. So one thing I've struggled with is the stigma that many in the US non-profits have, that they are not real businesses. And I think, Maria, you touched on that right at the beginning, didn't you? Saying it's a very professional environment. It's you know, the different challenges, but also a lot of the same ones.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly that wasn't something that I experienced in the business that I was in the UK.
Yeah.
So we had people headhunted by non-normal commercial businesses in the arts sector.
Yeah.
Because our people had really good experience, great development, and were really capable. So I would say certainly in our sector that wasn't my experience in the UK.
Okay, good. Okay, so if someone is looking to get into a role in a not-for-profit in general, so what are the kind of skills and values that the organisation in those sectors might be looking for? So, Michael, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, and shall I start with values, Maria, and then we can talk about skills. So as you probably evidenced me, is you have to make sure there's value alignment between what's important to you and the organisation. And therefore, it's not a question of thinking, well, I want to do some good, I'm going to join any charity. You have to really have done that research around understanding the things that are important to you and finding charities. So whether it's sustainability, whether it's health, and that's the only way, in my view, are you going to get it. And therefore, one of my number one tips about getting in there is I would have expected you to have volunteered in, not necessarily in the same charity, but in the area of where the charity is doing, to get in there, as demonstrating your commitment to the organisation and what it does. So value is very important. Maria, what about skills?
Yeah, well, certainly in the not-for-profit sector, I think, again, the values piece is important. But in terms of skills, very similar to skills requirements in the normal commercial sector. So very kind of job specific in terms of technical capabilities and professional capabilities. I guess, a big emphasis on softer skills and being able to bring people along, because the culture is very positive, productive, a big learning environment. Motivating people, obviously, and keeping them interested. Although you can't always give them the financial benefits, it's kind of how do we keep people motivated? So I think those are the sorts of skills in particular that we're looking for. But at the end of the day, it is, if it's a professional role, it's good technical professional skills, and if it's a specialist role, again, good skills in that area. And most of the roles did have some kind of core background, because again, I think there isn't necessarily a great kind of space for just general administrators. People tend to have a specialist skill, whether it's IT, whether it's, in our case, arts management, legal, finance, whatever that might be.
Yeah. And one skill you didn't mention, Maria, which I think is very important, and it's like, we think it's not for profit. I'm going to say it's a sales skill. So significant time and effort in most of the not-for-profit charities is spent on how they generate revenues, and that can be everything from a little black book of very wealthy donors to running huge events to raise money. So they do have this sort of what I call very sophisticated revenue generation facility, which private sector would call sales. It's not quite the same, but it's very competitive. So I think I'm going to say there's 3 areas. You've got what I call delivery skills. So and that can be very specific to the charity. So again, for example, employing nurses or social workers, depending on it. You've definitely got what you call the technical skills, the IT, HR, marketing, finance. And then you've also got leadership management skills, because again, some of these are very sophisticated organizations with large either workforces or volunteers to be managed. So that's how I would characterize it.
Okay, so we did touch on salaries. Would you expect that salaries are much lower than in other sectors? So Maria, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say much lower, and I think it depends again on the circumstances. What I would say is that you don't quite get all the bells and whistles, certainly, that you got in fund management, which won't be a surprise to anybody. So sometimes there are small bonuses, but nothing like the level that you might see in some commercial sectors. We didn't have a lot of kind of company cars and all the rest of it. But we did what we could to give people decent benefits, at the kind of lower cost end, to the extent that we actually all had a monthly massage, which was a lovely benefit. So we had a masseur come in every month, and everybody who wanted a massage could have one. So little things like that make kind of working life pleasant, really. So, and great work-life balance as well. So, really good holiday allowances. In general, kind of working hours were very reasonable, unless there was a specific reason why we needed to do extra, in which case everybody appreciated that. So, the working conditions were good.
Yeah. Michael, your view on salaries?
I think it's a function of the size of the organisation. So if you take the larger charities, Cancer Research, Wellcome Trust, who are competing with commercial organisations for highly skilled scientists, then the terms and conditions definition have to be very similar. I think if you're talking much more smaller charities or smaller organisations who are absolutely struggling in terms of budget, then they'll pay the least they need to. And as Maria has very ably said, they're not sophisticated packages in the sense of there's not lots of add-ons. They tend to be a salary. And I come back to my point about the work-life balance. I think the organisations can be much more flexible the way they approach their people, where they work and when they work. But I come back, my experience of working with the CEOs of some of these charities, they are very demanding employers in terms of they do expect people. And by the way, because the people themselves are there primarily because they subscribe to the mission and purpose, what we said earlier about values, people don't mind doing it because, it's less of a job, it's more of a vocation, and it's what I want to do. It's how I'm defining myself. So,
Yeah, and I think that's a really key element of working in that sort of organisation is that, if you're having a bit of a bad day, that we all have sometimes, you just think of all those artists that you're helping to support, and it makes you feel a whole lot better. Yeah. So I think that is something that is great about working in that sort of organisation. Everybody has got a kind of common purpose, effectively.
Yeah, quite a tangible end product almost. Yeah, that's good. So we've got another question from Jeff, and I think this is a really good question because it will just kind of show the size of the market. But he's asking how many not-for-profits are there in the UK? Any ideas on stats? So he's followed up with how many there are in the US. So according to the National Centre for Charitable Statistics, there are more than 1.5 million non-profit organisations registered in the USA. So it covers public charities, private foundations, other types of non-profits, including chambers of commerce, fraternal organisations, and civic leagues. So I guess that, as I said, it means it's quite a big market, isn't it? So there are potentially quite a lot of roles around.
That's a really interesting question, and actually, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it would be sizable if you put it all together. And I guess if you think of, commercial sector, public sector, and then third sector, yeah, I couldn't put a number on it, but it's sizable, and there are a lot of interesting organisations out there that would come under that bracket.
So we will look into that, Jeff. Thank you. It's a good question and a good point.
Okay, for
Michael.
Time.
Okay.
This is charities, so this is only one special. In the UK, there's 169,000. I'm surprised, Jeff, it's only $1.5 million. I would have thought it was much bigger, because I'm going to say I suspect we are at least half to 1 million, half to 1 million of this type of organisations. Let's say there's 169,000 registered charities.
Okay.
So, according to Google.
Okay, so with all those opportunities, then how do you go about finding them? So, Maria, have you got any views on how? So, how did you find your role? And
yeah. So I found mine in my HR magazine.
Okay.
And I guess one of the things about certainly the not-for-profit bit of the sector that I worked in is that this strong values thing means that you do work to do things properly. So all roles tend to be advertised. Obviously, we're also looking to minimise costs, so that is always an issue. But we tended to put quite a lot on Guardian online. We also use LinkedIn. So kind of low cost ways of making those jobs known to people, and always looking at how can we improve that. But it was always a big emphasis on fair selection, big emphasis on diversity and inclusion. So yeah, jobs tended, unless they were going to be recruited internally, they would be advertised.
Okay, Michael, any views?
And I agree with what Maria just said, that that level of transparency is important, particularly if there's a level of public accountability, i.e. they're spending public money on what they're doing. So that's the first point. The second thing I'm going to say is that not only they both have sophisticated and time-consuming recruitment processes. So almost every time I've worked with somebody who's got it, they've had to make a presentation. And probably had 2 or 3 interviews. So so be prepared. It's not an interview and you get offered a job. It takes quite a long time. Having said that, and those people will know me, I make a great play of networking is critical to job searching. So whilst there are formal processes, for example, a big source of recruitment for a not-for-profit comes from volunteering, or being aware that a vacancy is coming up is obviously a real advantage to you if you have been volunteering. So I'm not in any way saying Maria's wrong in terms of there is an open and honest, transparent process, but as always, if you're in the know and you're in the know early, it's a big advantage. We've also got, I don't know if you did the research, sir, there's a whole group of recruiters and headhunters who specialize in this area, particularly I know from my experience around the sales generation. So and the bigger charities will use headhunters to get specialist people. So it's like any job in that sense. Do we have any look on identifying recruiters in that space, Sarah?
So I've done a few searches, and there are a few that do specialise in this area. So what I would say then, for what I would do is I would look at those and then look at them on LinkedIn and just see how active they are on LinkedIn and get a bit more information that way. I think that's the benefit of LinkedIn, that you can see the people that work for those recruiters, you can see how active they are. And how successful they are. So yes, I can add some links to some of the ones that I've found.
Yeah. And the thing I was going to say, if you're serious about making this move, before you start applying for jobs which are advertised, is do your research. And that research will almost certainly have a conversation with somebody working in the charity about what it's like to work for. And that's why LinkedIn becomes very helpful. So you're never going, if you're applying directly to a charity and you haven't done that research and you've not talked to anybody in it, your likelihood of success is very, very low. So my view is it's no different to anywhere else. You've got to do the preparation before you make the application.
Yeah. We've got a question from John. I know John's in Chicago, so morning, John. And he's saying here, LinkedIn notifications, I get about 30 jobs a day, usually the same 30, but not one of them has been for a not-for-profit. So I guess the percentage of them advertising roles compared to professional organisations might be smaller, but you could have a look at setting up some job alerts specifically for these. So I will have a quick look afterwards just to see how you might be able to do that, because you can set up 20 notifications a day. 20 job alerts on LinkedIn. So you could potentially set one up which is specifically for not-for-profit. So I will have a look at that.
And I would say, John, that it's a good question, but because of the cost constraints on the charities, a lot will do their own recruitment, and therefore I'm going to say a lot will use LinkedIn as a way of either advertising vacancies or identifying candidates. So it's definitely in the right space to get a role then.
And it may well be that they don't actually use the job search facility to advertise a job. They may use it just by posting. So I think it will probably be a question of setting up some filters in the kind of normal LinkedIn, not the job search. And then you'd be able to search on keywords. So that might be an option as well. And Jeff's come up with some stats. So thank you, Jeff. I can't open that from here, but we will have a look at that later. So I'm guessing this is all about how many charities there are. So brilliant. Thank you. Okay, we are pretty much out of time. I just wanted to touch on one other thing which we have mentioned, which is about career progression. So Michael, you mentioned this already. So what kind of progression might there be in not-for-profit?
And it does depend. So if I'm going to describe, if you're in what I call a caseworker, i.e. delivering what the charity or the not-for-profit is focused on, it's very often that people will do that because they care passionately about the service. They'll spend 5 to 8 years and then they will move out, taking those skills into another sector. If we take about functional specialists, then career progression, I think, is more difficult because often there isn't a number of roles. So there'll probably be a head of IT. And if you're the number, well, the likelihood is you'll move within that charity space, not to go through. Having said that, when I meet CEOs or C-suite individuals of charities, 9 times out of 10, they started at the very bottom, either as a volunteer or doing something. So for a small group of people, there is upward progression. For a lot of people, it's movement away, and for others, it's movement across. And as we said earlier, once you're in that space, it is very possible to move across charities. Does that help, Sarah?
Yeah, and I think that was my experience. I did some work with a large charity, and what they were finding was they had quite a high turnover of graduates. So they would come in, do a year or so, and then move on. But what they then did is introduce this kind of mobility program where you went across sectors, not sectors, sorry, specialism. So you might have started in marketing, then you move into HR. So it's almost like a rotational thing. So it's more about getting a breadth of knowledge more than a sort of a hierarchical climb for most, as you say. But then obviously there are some who will then be able to move up the organisation. So that was what they had found.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly saw some examples of very good career progression for people, and it was a small organisation. So it's like if there's 2 of you in IT and demand grows, then your job grows, and that very much happened. So I think people could get some really good development.
Okay, so we'll move on to our top tip. So we've had lots more to talk about than we anticipated today. So Michael, your top tip from today for people looking for roles in these organisations?
I'm going to say it's follow your passion. So first and foremost, it's about what's important to you. And if you want to work in this sector, you must absolutely be passionate around what the organisation does, believe in the organisation, and sort of so it's not something you can do with indifference, in my view. Follow your passion.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is absolutely key. And in addition to that, make sure it is the job that you want as well, because obviously you want to make sure the core of your profession and what you're hoping to do is there, and also explore what the opportunities are as well to move that forward, because there certainly are there.
Brilliant, thank you. And Jeff has just come back to say about the searching on LinkedIn. So thinking about different terms, so non-profit, non-dash profit. So you will need to do searches on all of those different things. So yes, so searching can get really complex on LinkedIn, but then that does bring back really good results. So thank you for that, Jeff. Okay, so we are out of time, as I said. Next week it is National Work Life Week, which who knew that was a thing? So basically this week is all about employers showcasing what they are doing for their employees. So we will be talking next week about how you can ensure your next role supports your work-life requirements. So Catherine Lambert and Chris Thorne will be back next week. So looking forward to that one. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. We will add some comments to the chat afterwards with agencies, replies to the questions, etc. If you do have any other questions, please do feel free to add them. But thank you very much for joining and see you next week.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.